May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. On my return to Newport, after about 3 weeks in England for the Lambeth Conference, I found my garden in a riotously abundant condition. It was teeming with tomatoes of every variety, gorgeous round red hybrids like Better Boy and Beefsteak, along with heirlooms like Black Prim, Cherokee Purple, Mr. Stripey. There were great big globular fruits bigger than softballs and smaller cherry tomatoes of all of those varieties, even the heirlooms, as well as tiny little grape tomatoes. The garden is chaotic, unruly, completely uncontained, and I am not in control. And the crook-necked squash vine, which, by the way, I did not plant, has now escaped the bounds of the garden fence and is bursting out in blooms and fruits all over the yard with the surprise and the excitement of fireworks in the summer night sky. None of the tomatoes or cucumbers or other vegetables that I planted survived. But I think I finally understand why there is such glorious bounty nonetheless. It's as extravagant as the sower of seeds in that old Pete Seeger ballad. Maybe even wasteful if you count all those tomatoes I can't reach. What does it mean not to be in control? What does it feel like when everything you've ever learned and every gardening standard you've ever been judged on tells you that tomatoes should be spaced 24 to 36 inches apart and never ever planted in a place where tomatoes or potatoes or eggplants have been planted in the past 3 years? Yet the abundant life of the garden actively resists these learned scientific constraints, not just once, but year after year. From a transactional lawyer's or a rector's perspective, this is disorganized and inefficient. And in a gardener's careful plan for ease of harvest, even access to sun, and careful spacing for root development, tomatoes belong in neat little rows, 24 to 36 inches apart. But this self-seeding anarchic garden defies both science and tradition, as well as wasting all of the tomatoes that I can't even reach through those thickets of vines. But those tomatoes I can't reach, reseed the garden for next year. So I'm pretty sure nothing is wasted in God's economy, even though I'm not in control of the bottom line. I wonder how the Pharisees felt when Jesus healed the woman who had been bent down for 18 years by an unclean spirit. After all, there's a time and a place for that kind of thing. Maybe at the unclean spirit healing place during normal office hours. But certainly not in the synagogue, and not on the Sabbath. And just to make this point clear, Luke's gospel mentions the Sabbath 5 times in just this one little passage, and hints at it twice more. There's no question that health is good, and being bent over at the waist for 18 years like the woman in the story is bad and needs to be fixed. We're supposed to notice, we're supposed to see that time, place, and manner are at stake, not healing. Because it's easy, really easy to distinguish between good and evil. And Luke's gospel makes sure that we understand the conflict here is not over what's good, but about how and when to get to that good. The Pharisees were not bad people. They were very observant, faithful, learned Jews who always showed up for worship, kept the fasts, said their prayers, kind of like all of us who come to worship on Sunday mornings and always remember to pledge. It's hard to live in a world where the rules are changing and where what we've always done before doesn't work anymore. I can really relate to the Pharisees' discomfort. And from the content of the news every single day, I don't think I'm the only one who feels confused and maybe a little bit threatened. And I think it might help us to walk openly in the Pharisees' sandals for just a minute here. In this story, all the Pharisees wanted was to be good people before God. And they and the generations before them had spent their whole lives learning the applicable rules to do just that. Their whole way of life was called into question when Jesus makes the common sense point that healing on the Sabbath in the synagogue is the moral and theological equivalent of untying their donkey or their ox to allow it to reach water to drink. And yet, are we missing something if we immediately rejoice that the tables are turned on the Pharisees' expectations? The narrative setup in this story almost requires us to side with Jesus. But Scripture is subtle and layered and deep. And I think we might miss an important insight into our lives and attitudes if we don't own up to our alter egos here in this drama, the Pharisees, who are just trying to do the right thing in the context that they know. As preacher Elizabeth Palmer says, this rejoicing can harden into punitive judgment, and people we disagree with become enemies that need to be vanquished. Once those we disagree with become the other, it's easy to feel like we can't be right without the other side being wrong. Wrong about God, wrong about how to worship, or wrong about politics. If we can't allow the truth of another's context and experience in order for us to be right, and someone else has to be wrong, we find ourselves on a constantly shifting seesaw of glory and shame. We seek always to be on the side that is rising, and everyone else who's wrong on the downside. But this way of living in the world is not only destabilizing and uncertain, it also bases all our relationships in judgment rather than in grace. Our opportunity is to understand our different contexts and to be ready to walk in the other sandals for a while. Coming from different contexts or seeking to remain in a context that no longer actually looks like our surroundings now doesn't necessarily mean one side is wrong. Like all that good in my chaotic, unruly garden, more than one thing can be true at one time. You don't have to be wrong for me to be right. Awareness of and respect for different truths does invite us to unbend our spines and stand up straight, to be healed by Jesus if we have been bound by rules and practices and understandings that no longer fit our reality. The woman with the bent spine had been that way for 18 years. 18 years ago, it was 2004. Can you think of any attitude or understanding that you might have had in 2004 that doesn't fit with our realities anymore? We can see much better when we unbend ourselves from experiences that have become contortions in our existing world. In a post-Lambeth summary last week, the Archbishop of Canterbury described the two aims of the Lambeth Conference. First was the renewal of spiritual life among the bishops and the spouses. Second was to turn to face outwards after decades of looking in at ourselves. The best way of dealing with internal challenges is to seek God. It is God who turns us to serve God's mission in the world and contextualizes our internal struggles in the knowledge of the overwhelming horror and suffering. Archbishop Justin continued, the conference was a success, not because it produced a great outburst of agreement, but because it showed in a very fractured world that disagreement without hatred is possible. Diversity is a gain, not a problem. And that we can find greater unity if we look outwards and give ourselves to God's mission in the world. As island dwellers ourselves, even though we have thrived for generations on energy uses and conveniences that have improved our standard of living, we can understand the climate emergency that challenges other islands in our own context and see what we need to do in our part to change. What happens when we unbend our spines and look outwards instead of looking in on ourselves? What can we at Emmanuel Church do to make a difference in our environment? At our vestry meeting this week, one vestry member suggested that we establish a community container garden in the churchyard to invite the whole community around us into a project to conserve water while growing food. Watering our lawn, which only feeds our resident rabbits, takes dwindling and increasingly expensive freshwater resources in this fragile earth, our island home, as our Eucharistic prayer praises our opportunity for climate repentance. Would a container garden in our churchyard like that make all the difference the world needs? No, probably not. But I think it could make a big difference in each of us. As God told the prophet Jeremiah in our reading this morning, do not say, I am only just a boy, or only just me. For you shall go out to whom I send you, and you shall speak whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you. Now I have put words in your mouth. See, today I appoint you over nations and over kingdoms to build